The night was dark and silent, the kind where even a whisper could echo through the quiet township of Welch Whittle. John Roper, a 76-year-old yeoman, lay in his bed, his mind wandering over the day's events. His sons, Richard and Henry, were also in the house, and they were all in possession of something valuable, 200 pounds of the king's money. It was a significant sum, enough to draw attention. Some said it was collected from recusancy fines, others that it was to be paid to the king's treasury in London. Whatever the reason, it was a dangerous burden to bear. Around 11 p.m., the silence was shattered by the barking of a dog. John Roper stirred, his eyes snapping open. He could hear the muffled sounds of someone trying to break down the front door. The attackers were using a piece of timber, ramming it repeatedly. The door held firm, but the noise was enough to wake the entire household. "Get ready." John shouted to his sons, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at his heart. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find, pistols, cudgels, anything that could help them defend their home and the king's money. The attackers, realizing the front door was too strong, moved to a nearby window. They smashed it with a heavy stone, but the opening was too small for them to fit through. Frustrated, they found another door and began to break it down. This time the door gave way, and the intruders burst into the house. Pistols were drawn, and the air was filled with the sound of gunfire. The walls and posts of the house were soon marked with the scars of bullets. John Roper and his sons fought with everything they had. John, despite his age, was a formidable opponent. He claimed to have suffered 16 grievous wounds, Richard 10 and Henry 13. But their bravery paid off. One of the attackers was wounded, and the intruders realized they were in trouble. Worried that a dead body would lead to their capture, they quickly placed the wounded man on a horse and fled into the night. The Ropers, though battered and bruised, had managed to protect the king's money. The house was a mess, and the night was far from over, but they had survived. The next morning, the town of Welch Whittle was abuzz with news of the attack. People gathered around the Roper house, marveling at the damage and the bravery of the family. John Roper, despite his wounds, was determined to report the incident to the authorities. He wanted justice, and he wanted to ensure that the king's money was safe. The news spread quickly, reaching the ears of the local officials and eventually making its way to London. The king's exchequer was concerned, and an investigation was launched. John Roper's account of the attack was meticulously recorded, and the hunt for the attackers began. But the story of the Ropers and the king's money was just the beginning. In the small parish of Cartmel, a year later, a strange and shocking event would unfold, one that would bring the tensions and conflicts of the time to the surface in a way no one could have predicted. On St. James's Day, 25 July 1604, the parish church of Cartmel was bustling with activity. It was a day of celebration, but something was different. A group of men dressed in women's clothing had gathered in the church. They were not there for a solemn ceremony, but for a mock wedding. The church was filled with laughter and cheers, but beneath the revelry, there was a sense of defiance and rebellion. The mock wedding was more than just a bit of fun. It was a form of resistance. In a time of religious and political tension, such acts were a way for people to express their discontent and challenge the authorities. The men involved in the mock wedding were known to be recusant Catholics who refused to attend the Church of England services, and their actions were a bold statement against the religious policies of the time. The local authorities were outraged. They saw the mock wedding as a mockery of the church and a challenge to the established order. The participants were quickly arrested, and the incident was recorded in legal documents, setting the stage for a complex and revealing tale of conflict, resistance, and the power of local traditions in a changing world. The events in Welch Whittle and Cartmel were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger story of religious and political conflict in early 17th century Lancashire. The burglary at the Roper house and the mock wedding in Cartmel were both acts of rebellion, each in its own way. They highlighted the deep divisions and tensions that existed in the community, and the lengths to which people would go to resist the authorities and maintain their beliefs. The story of the Cartmel cross-dresser and the mock wedding is a fascinating window into the lives of ordinary people during a time of great change. It is a story of courage, defiance, and the complex interplay of religion, politics, and local tradition. As we delve deeper into the events that unfolded, we will uncover the hidden layers of this intriguing tale and the people who shaped it. The day was July 25th, 1604, St. James's Day, a day when the people of Cartmel usually celebrated with a special sermon and a traditional rush-bearing procession. The parishioners had planned a sermon by Mr. Francis Fletcher, a traveling preacher, to mark the occasion. Fletcher was known for his powerful speeches, and the parish was excited to hear him. As the day approached, the parish leaders announced the sermon for 10 a.m. and invited everyone to join in the rush-bearing after the service. The church was filled with eager listeners as Fletcher began his sermon. But as he started to explain the text, something strange happened. The sound of a drum and bagpipes echoed outside, followed by the loud noise of guns being fired. The curate and a churchwarden went to see what was going on and found a large crowd outside the church, carrying rushes and led by a man named William Dawson, who held a rod or truncheon. Many in the crowd were disguised, with some young men dressed in women's clothing. These were mostly servants of the Thornborough family, who lived at Hampsfield Hall. The Thornboroughs were Catholics, and Jane Thornborough, the wife of Rowland Thornborough, was a key figure in the group. William Dawson, who worked for Jane's father-in-law, William Thornborough, led the crowd into the church. Fletcher tried to continue his sermon, but the crowd was determined to stop him. They entered the church, and Fletcher had to come down from the pulpit. He pleaded with them to let him finish, but they ignored him. The crowd divided into smaller groups, and they began to march through the church, strewing rushes on the floor. Then, in a surprising turn of events, a group of men and women, some dressed in men's clothes and some in women's, performed a mock wedding in the chancel. They read from the Book of Common Prayer and acted out the ceremony, making fun of the traditional wedding service. After the mock wedding, the crowd moved outside the church. One of them climbed up on a wall and made a mock proclamation, saying that Momus, the Greek god of satire, had had his time to speak and would not stay any longer. By Momus, they clearly meant the Protestant clergy. A written version of the proclamation was handed out, and the crowd left the church, possibly heading to St. Andrew's Moor to play sports. This event was more than just a prank. It was a deep-seated protest against the Protestant Church and the new order. The Thornboroughs and their supporters were making a statement, using the old traditions and rituals to express their discontent with the religious changes that had been imposed on them. John Roper, who had already been involved in a legal battle with James Anderton, a local justice of the peace, saw this as an opportunity to further his case. Roper accused Anderton of being complicit in the burglary and of failing to properly handle the situation in Cartmel. Roper's legal team, including the famous lawyer Sir Edward Coke, gathered evidence and presented it to the Star Chamber, a powerful court that dealt with serious cases involving the state. The court's procedure was thorough. Roper's team prepared a bill of complaint, and Anderton and the other defendants had to respond with their own sworn statements. Witnesses were questioned, and their testimonies were recorded in detail. Some of the witnesses, like Jane Thornborough and William Dawson, confirmed parts of the story, but there were discrepancies. For example, some witnesses said that William Dawson carried a rod or cudgel, but none said he was dressed as a Lord of Misrule. As the case unfolded, more details emerged. It was clear that the Thornboroughs and their supporters were deeply opposed to the Protestant Church, and were using old traditions to make their point. The mock wedding and the proclamation were symbolic acts, meant to show their rejection of the new religious order and their desire to return to the old ways. The legal battle between Roper and Anderton continued, with each side trying to prove their case. The Star Chamber, with its detailed procedures and extensive records, provided a platform for this complex dispute. The case revealed the deep tensions between the old and new religious practices in Lancashire, and the lengths to which some people would go to express their dissatisfaction with the changes they saw in their community. The day at Cartmel Church was unlike any other. The village was buzzing with excitement. People gathered, and the scene was a mix of fun and chaos. Anne Preston, a gentlewoman, heard the sound of a drum and the firing of guns. She saw men and women entering the church carrying bundles of rushes. Some of the people had their faces covered, and a few were dressed in costumes, with some men wearing women's clothes. Hugh Dickinson, another villager, also heard the drum and the gunshots. He saw boys with summer rods entering the church while Mr. Fletcher was in the pulpit, The boys were followed by people carrying rushes. Among them were 5 or 6 people in disguise, some dressed as men and others as women. They all went up to the chancel. Dickinson even thought he recognized some of the dresses, which belonged to local women. William Dawson and Jane Thornborough, who were part of the event, admitted that there was a rush bearing and some music. Dawson said there was only 1 pipe, 1 drum, and 1 gun, and the gun was fired outside the church. Jane admitted that some people were in disguise, but they were her father-in-law's servants, not hers. She also mentioned that an announcement was made, but it was just to gather the young people for fun on St. Andrew's Moor. The most interesting part of the day was the mock wedding. The bill of complaint described it as a profane and abominable act that mocked holy matrimony. But did it really happen? The witnesses from that day were not very clear. Anne Preston and Hugh Dickinson had only heard about the wedding but didn't see it. Dawson and Thornborough denied it altogether. The key to understanding what happened came from William Farrington, an older man who had a long-standing feud with James Anderton. Farrington met with Francis Fletcher, the preacher who was present during the event. Fletcher told Farrington about the disturbance and how he was pressured by Mr. Sorey, the parson of Windermere, to keep quiet. Sorey even threatened Fletcher, saying it might harm his friends, including Mr. Anderton. Farrington also mentioned that Fletcher had written a detailed account of the event, which he was willing to share. This account, along with Farrington's testimony, provided strong evidence that the mock wedding did take place. Cartmel was a small, poor parish. The church was in bad shape, and the people were struggling. Despite this, the village had a rich tradition of festive events, like rush bearing. Rush bearing involved processing with rushes to decorate the church. It was a joyful event, often with music, dancing, and even cross-dressing. The young men who participated in the mock wedding were part of this tradition. They were not outsiders but local villagers who would eventually settle down and start families. The mock wedding at Cartmel could have been a way for the young people to resist the attempts to reform their festive traditions. The church and the authorities were trying to stop disorderly events and even reform the marriage ceremony. The mock wedding, with its cross-dressing and disruption, might have been a playful but pointed protest against these changes. The event at Cartmel was more than just a silly prank. It was a reflection of the tensions between traditional village life and the efforts to impose new religious and social norms. The young people of Cartmel, through their mock wedding, were expressing their resistance to these changes in their own way. The Cartmel wedding was part of a long-standing tradition of festive celebrations that had become controversial. For Thornborough, it might have been a playful way to explore the growing divide within the official church. As historian Phoebe Jensen suggests, such festivities could help maintain Catholic cultural identity during tough times, while also keeping a popular tradition alive, especially among the youth. It was also an act of drama, a theatrical form of mockery and resistance. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with the spirit of festive misrule, or what is often called the carnivalesque. Cross-dressing was a common part of this tradition, symbolizing a world turned upside down. The Book of Common Prayer and the established church were being linked to disorder. Carnivalesque performances often involved a transition from disorder to order, much like the movement from Carnival to Lent. One famous example is Pieter Bruegel the Elder's painting, The Fight Between Carnival and Lent, which features a mock wedding with a potentially cross-dressed bride. At Cartmel, there was a similar transition. The Protestant disorder, symbolized by the topsy-turvy wedding, was followed by a return to Catholic order, dramatized by the expulsion of Momus, a figure representing disorder. This expulsion might have been a symbolic ritual, where the discordant sounds of bagpipes, pipes, and drums represented chaos, and the movement out of the church symbolized the expulsion of disorder from the religious community. The use of the state ritual, Solemn Oyas, to announce the end of the days of satire, might have symbolized a hope for religious toleration under the Jacobean regime, even though this hope was never realized. Michael Bakhtin, a famous scholar, argued that the carnivalesque was inherently oppositional to the formalism of the established social order. However, some argue that these festivities were a safety valve that provided a brief escape from reality, ultimately reinforcing the existing order. The Cartmel wedding, however, seems to have been a genuine attempt to push for change, challenging the social order rather than reinforcing it. Beckton also believed that the Carnivalesque was about renewal, an idea that fits with the events at Cartmel. Festive misrule was often used in local religious controversies. Mockery of the clergy often involved carnivalesque elements, such as the burlesque imitation of sacraments. For example, during the Civil Wars, animals were sometimes baptized in a mock ceremony. The Martin Marprelate controversy in the 1580s also saw the use of festival language, with some opponents of Martin Marprelate portraying him as a lord of misrule, whose reign of satire would end with a return to order. Many Puritans opposed such festivities, and mocking them as lords of misrule was a clever jab. This might be the subtext at Cartmel, especially considering the pointed questions about Francis Fletcher, who was accused of causing dissent and conflict. The invocation of Momus, a figure known for his fault-finding and scoffing, was crucial. Momus appeared in Aesop's Fables and Fox's Book of Martyrs, and was described as a scoffer with a scornful manner, who mocked and condemned everything. He was often used as a shorthand for Protestants, especially the more critical ones. The association with fault-finding made Momus a convenient symbol for Protestants, and the more strict ones in particular. To understand the Cartmel wedding, we need to place it in the context of 1604. After Elizabeth's reign, some Catholics in Lancashire hoped for a return to Rome. There was a significant increase in recusancy, with acts of open defiance and even a plot to capture Chester. Many Catholics hoped for toleration, similar to what the Huguenots received in France. However, by the summer of 1604, these hopes were fading. James I had ordered all Jesuits and seminary priests to leave the country, and the Hampton Court Conference had reinforced the English state's commitment to Protestantism. A new version of the Book of Common Prayer was introduced, and new church canons were established, reinforcing the status quo. The wedding might have been a last act of defiance, a prank to distract from the increasingly grim situation. It is possible that the inhabitants of Cartmel were aware of the new prayer book, but uncertain about its content. The new canons demanded ministers subscribe to Archbishop Whitgift's 3 articles, which were offensive to many Puritans. James I issued a proclamation on July 16, 1604, ordering subscription to the articles by November 30th. If news of this reached Cartmel in time for St. James's Day, it might explain the reference to the end of the days of Momus. The precise relationship between the Cartmel wedding and the politics of 1604 is unclear, but the wedding reveals a rich tapestry of meaning. It combines popular culture, Catholic resistance, and festive traditions. The incident shows how local actions could tie into broader issues, using humor and the language of misrule to make a political point. It was a small act of resistance, using disorder, mockery, and the appropriation of state rituals to long for a return to Rome. Unlike the more radical plots of the time, this was a jovial and mocking form of resistance, fitting into a tradition of little politics that used various forms of protest, including litigation, libels, and ritual humiliation. The Thornboroughs and Andertons, through their small-scale actions, helped keep Catholicism alive in a devolved state. Churches in Scotland during the 1550s to 1650s were not the quiet, peaceful places we might imagine today. They were often the scenes of violent disputes and fights. This chapter explores how and why people used churches as places to settle their differences, especially through the lens of blood feuds and religious conflicts. In the early 1550s, before the Reformation, the Scottish Church faced significant challenges. People sometimes disrupted church services and vandalized religious objects, often driven by religious or political motives. One famous example is the Bloody Vespers in Elgin Cathedral in 1555, where 2 families, the Inness and the Dunbars, clashed during a service. This incident, though extreme, highlights how church buildings and yards were common sites for such conflicts. Feuds, which were long-standing disputes between families or groups, often played out in churches. Historians like Michael Graham have studied how local feuds influenced church violence. Unlike in England, where seating disputes were common, Scottish church violence was more about settling local feuds. For example, in 1589, sailors named Alan and Patrick Carstairs attacked James Cuthbert during a sermon, showing that even ordinary people could be involved in these feuds. The Scottish government tried to address this violence. In 1552, a law was passed to punish those who disturbed church services, with fines and even imprisonment for repeat offenders. The church itself also took steps to maintain order, with the General Provincial Council in 1558, 1559 calling for investigations into vandalism and other disturbances. The Reformation in 1560 brought new forms of religious conflict. Some people opposed the new Protestant order, and their resistance sometimes turned violent. For example, William Balfour from Leith was charged with blasphemy and sedition for verbally attacking the new form of communion in 1561. This shows how religious and political issues were closely intertwined. Despite efforts to control church violence, it continued into the 17th century. However, the nature of these conflicts changed. By the 1620s, feuds were less violent and more about local disputes. The church and government continued to play a role in resolving these conflicts, with the church's influence growing through kirk sessions and religious teachings. The mid-1600s, particularly during the 1640s, saw significant political and religious upheaval in Scotland. This period remains understudied, but it likely played a crucial role in the decline of blood feuds. The church's emphasis on order and the centralization of law through the courts contributed to this decline. By the 1640s, the concept of private justice through feuds was becoming less acceptable. In summary, the churches in Scotland during the 1550s to 1650s were often the sites of violent disputes, reflecting the broader social and religious tensions of the time. While these conflicts gradually declined, they left a lasting impact on Scottish society, shaping the way people thought about justice and order. The legacy of this period can still be seen in the way modern Scotland values peace and legal resolution over vigilante justice.